The
Welcome
Varsity
back
Voices
to the
podcast,
Varsity
part of the
Voices High
Varsity
School
Voices
Sports
Media
Talk,
Network,
your home for
where we
everything
talk high school sports,
the
with that
Chicago
extra
Catholic
spotlight
League
of
football,
focus
and
on
the
everything
Chicago
in
Catholic
between.
League. And tonight,
Please
we're diving into
subscribe,
something
and
every
follow
football fan
wherever
can
you are listening
appreciate this
from,
time
and
of
don't
year.
forget to follow
A
us
little
on
taste
social
of
media
what's
as
to
well.
come. We're taking
I'm
an
one of your
early
hosts,
look
Joe
at the
Frevaletti, and with me
2025
is your
Chicago
other host,
Catholic League
Dan
football
Frevaletti.
schedules.
And Dan,
It's never too
we've talked
soon to
about
get
a
your
lot
football
of things
fix,
over
and
the
with some
past
of the
several
top
months.
matchups
Since the football
already
season
set,
has
we're
ended,
going to break down
and not
key
all
dates, some
exclusively
early
football
season showdowns,
related, but I'm
and the
starting to
games
get the
that
itch
could shake up the
talk a little
conference
Chicago
standings.
Catholic League
Whether you're a
football.
player,
Are you
coach,
feeling it too,
parent,
Dan?
or diehard
It's funny.
fan,
Just
this
as
episode is
it
for you.
feels
So
like
grab
just
your
as baseball
schedule,
gets rolling, I start
mark
to
your
feel
calendar,
get the itch for football.
and let's
You know, I
talk
know that I know
Chicago
teams are
Catholic
starting to
League
meet
football.
and prepare for the summer and the practices
If you are
that
looking
they're
to
allowed
buy
to
or
have
sell a
and
home,
times getting together
contact
and
Remax
workouts
Realtor
are happening.
and Circle of
So,
Legends
so
recipient
you can start to
Christopher
feel
Cobb.
it a little bit.
Let
Every
Chris's
change of season,
extensive
it's like,
negotiating
okay,
experience
it's a
work to
little
guide you
closer.
on
You
all
start
of your
counting
real
down the
estate
days.
buying and
So
selling
this
needs.
is going to be a fun
Contact
look
Christopher
at the
now to
schedule.
discuss
So.
the right
It
strategy
is,
for
and
your
it'll,
personalized
like
real
I said, it'll
estate buying and
scratch
selling
that
plan.
itch a bit that I'm
His number
having
is
right now.
630
And what I thought we do, Dan, is maybe go
420-0070,
through
or you
kind
can
of,
visit his
division
website
by
at
division here and
christophercobb.com.
look at some of the games that are scheduled. I know there's a ton of information out there right now, especially regarding some of the preseason games, but we've got some stuff. Plus, we've got, obviously we know what the in-season schedule is going to be like, and there's going to be some key games there too. So how do you feel about starting with the white division, Dan?
Good, Joe. But you touched on something before we hop in here. That not all the schedules are out, and so we've got some as far as non-conference goes. So that either tells me that they haven't published it, which is fine, or there might be some teams still scrambling for games, which is always a challenge. It's a challenge for every school in Illinois to find some non-conference games, and you got to worry about, do I have to look out of state, and or do I have to play someone within the conference maybe who also doesn't have a game? Yeah, that's not my division, which I know some teams don't care, which we'll talk about, and some teams would rather not do that. So interesting in and of itself that we don't have a full schedule yet, and what that could mean. Like I said, it could just be that they're not published, but I guarantee that some schools are probably still scrambling for week 1 or week 2.
So I noticed there's a lot of teams that don't have their full schedule yet, especially those preseason games, obviously. But
yeah,
is it a little late to still be looking for a game or not?
Maybe. I think
based on your experience, yeah.
I think February is kind of, if you had to mark your calendar as how things you'd like to see things get done, I think everyone kind of takes the holidays off and then gets into workouts in January and start really pushing for their schedules, come February 1st. I think they'd like to have that done in the month of February so they can go into the spring not having to think about it. There's going to be coaches there. I guarantee there's coaches looking at film of their early opponents, or scrambling to get film, or taking some time on to research and look at YouTube and whatever and see who's done what in the past. And they're probably looking at max preps and some of the same things that you and I did to research a little bit of this. And so, yeah, I guarantee it's happening. I'm guessing that if someone doesn't have a game yet, that they're probably in scramble mode a little bit.
All right. So one more question about that, and then we'll move on. But a lot of teams seem to have that first week's game. They don't have that second week game out there. Do you think some teams or some schools might take that week off? No. So they're for sure going to find some game, no matter where it's at. They're going to play a game week.
Yeah, that'd be bad. You like, it's not, again, you can't really think about, at least most programs can't really think about resting people, and you have limited opportunities as a high school football player to play. You're only guaranteed 9 games, over 4 years. So, or I should, for each of the 4 years. So, I mean, it's limited. It's not, you're not dealing with, free agencies or rookies you're trying to get, or injuries that you're worried about. That you want to get those games, from a practical standpoint. You want the points, right, that go with that. You don't want to not have an opportunity to get playoff points as well, which we know, becomes a thing as the season goes on. So I guarantee that there's no one saying, we'll just take that second week off.
Yeah. I see that, right? Especially from a standpoint of, some of the schools who maybe are counting on those first two games to, in some cases they try and schedule, what they hope is going to be a win, right? To get some of those playoff points. But, as we go through this, Dan, I'm going to give, some of these schools going to give them kudos because those first two games, they've scheduled some tough opponents, right?
Yeah, there are some, and when we interviewed the St. Lawrence coach, he was all about it. Bring it on. Tell us who we have to play and we'll be there. Yeah. And, so there's some people who look at it like that and say, if we're good enough, we're going to be a good playoff team. And then some that want to say, that look at the Catholic League like you and I do as a meat grinder. Right. And so,
yes.
So it is. So they want to take those first 2 weeks and kind of not see what they've got. I know that happens anyway, and you don't want to look for tomato cans, but the
tomato cans.
Oh my reference, yeah, and
yeah.
So but you if you can find that perfect balance of competitiveness and but a better than 50-50 shot of winning, I think that's what most coaches would say privately, maybe not in an interview.
All right. We won't ask him that question, when we interview him coming up this year.
Yeah, they'll all say, bring it on. We don't care who we play, when we play.
Bring it on. The toughest opponent we can find.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, so let's jump in. Let's jump in with the white division. Let's start with Montini, Dan, defending state champs. They start off again this year with Hyde Park, who they trounced last year, I think, in the first game of the year, 49-0. But one of the things I looked at was what might be some of Montini's key games. They obviously they graduated a lot of players from last year's team, but I think if you look at some of their key games, I'm looking at weeks 3 and 4, and that's primarily to avenge their losses last year against Marist and Fenwick.
Yeah, and Montini is one of those teams that is, you start with Hyde Park, who like you said, they trounced last year. They're probably where last year they may have looked back and said, would have been nice to maybe play someone, or get a better challenge week 1. This year, I think they'll probably be grateful for it, So the quarterback is back, and that's a big deal. So you've got a guy there that can who's been there and done that on the highest level, highly recruited player, he's Israel Abrams, an outstanding player. So they're probably ready from that point of view, but they do have a lot of people to replace. So they probably are looking forward to that Hyde Park game and using that as kind of, all right, a barometer of, this is where we at. And this is where we are at, and this is what we have to get done before Marist and Fenwick. And because if I'm them, I've got those games circled because those are pretty big games in their early season schedule.
Yeah, they are. And their last conference game of the year again is against St. Lawrence, which, as far as a division or conference championship is concerned, I could easily see the white division coming down to that game between Montini and St. Lawrence. So to me, looking at that, that's another big game for them.
Yeah, and we said all along last year, I mean, even before the season started, how entertaining the white division was going to be. And so it was something that we really enjoyed watching and covering from our perspective. And, I expect nothing different this year. A lot of good teams, a lot of great players, returning quarterbacks all over, some high profile guys. So the white should be a lot of fun to watch again. And it wouldn't surprise me, going through these schedules, if a lot of things come down to that last week.
Yeah, me too. All right. So let's go to Fenwick. So last year they finished 8-3. They were, a play or two away from advancing to the 7A quarterfinals last year.
Yeah.
And one thing I like about what Fenwick and DePaul actually are doing this year is they're playing each other in week 1. So this is exactly what we were talking about. Like, hey, let's bring it on. Fenwick and DePaul Prep playing week 1, Dave.
Yeah, and I think both those teams and coaches would say, bring it on and mean it. I think they feel really good about their teams, really good about where their program's at. Think that they're ready for this type of a challenge. Both I'm sure are obviously looking at it as a win. And so it's I feel really fortunate to have this as far as from a coverage perspective. It's all about us, Joe.
For sure.
Yeah, and that this is a great week 1 game for the teams and for the fans.
Yeah, and the other thing about Fenwick is they only had 2 regular season losses last year, and those came against Joliet Catholic and Mount Carmel, right? Which I didn't realize. I know Fenwick was really good last year, and to only have 2 losses on your schedule last year, and those being to Joliet Catholic and Mount Carmel, that's nothing to nothing to be all that upset about. I would think that if I were Fenwick, I'd be looking at those 2 games again this year and thinking, we've got to at least pick off one of those this year.
Yeah, and they are in a great spot to do it. Returning quarterback, and they've got some really good players coming back. As I'm sure, we talked about last year. I'm sure their defense, it's going to be Fenwick football. We knock your block off,
knock your block off. Yes.
And so I expect nothing less. And, so kind of we can early circle that week 3 game against Joliet Catholic, because that's knock your block off versus smash Joliet Catholic football.
Yes, for sure. Yeah. All right, good. So another team in the white division, St. Lawrence. So last year, if they had gotten by DePaul Prep in the playoffs, Dan, they could have been state champs, don't you think?
Could have and probably would have.
Yeah.
Yes,
I agree too. I mean, their only regular season losses last year, they had 3 of them, right? They lost to Fenwick, they lost to Brother Rice, they lost to Montini. And I think what you probably have to look at this year are those 3 games again for St. Lawrence. They've got a new coach coming in, taking over a good team. Now they graduated some players last year or from last year, so they've got to rebuild or reload in some areas, but their conference games are not going to give them much time, is what I'm looking at here. They start off with King, and then I think they've got
off school. Yep, they made the playoffs last year.
Yep. So they've got to be ready to go from game 1, and they've got a tough conference schedule too.
Yeah, and I think that week 2 against Notre Dame, really interesting, because 2 new head coaches. One who's Dan DeFrance has been there forever at Notre Dame, so we'll see how they look, and if they're going to look and much different, than they have. I'm guessing they probably will. New offensive coordinator there, and St. Lawrence with a new coach and new people in place at key positions. They've had really good lower levels. The numbers are up there, so I expect Coach Swanson to have his guys ready. So that's kind of the one I've circled for both Lawrence and Notre Dame early on in the season.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Good. So the last team in the white division is Carmel Mundelein. When I looked at their schedule from last year and obviously what they're going to be doing this year, or who they're going to be playing, is Carmel a team that you expected more from last year than they ended up giving us, or not?
Yeah, and I think that they would say that. I think they were they were a hard luck team though too. If you remember, they had a lot of games that seemed to come down to the wire. At least that's what my memory is. I'm not sure if that's the case or not, but I know they won one of those against Providence. So
right.
Maybe lost one the week before. Did they lose to Grays Lake Central last year, Joe?
They beat Grays Lake Central, but then the second game they lost to Lake Forest 2014.
And that surprised me. However, Lake Forest went on to have a really good season.
They did.
So
yes.
So you can't assume anything about a non-conference schedule. So interesting that week 2 has not been filled out yet for Carmel. I'll be interested to see if maybe that contract is renewed or a second year, or maybe they're looking for something else. I would imagine if it were renewed that it would be on this schedule. But Disappointing may be too harsh for Carmel last year, but I think they are going to be a team that, like a lot of these CCL teams, Joe, they could be 3-6 and be a really good team. I mean, don't you think that, yes, Carmel obviously would have liked to have gone to the playoffs, and if they had gotten in, don't they also qualify for the story of how far would they have advanced in whatever division they would have been in? So they're one of those hard luck teams, and it's the other side of the coin when people say the private schools have it easy. Well, they got to get in first, and they got to get through the gauntlet of their schedule. So that's what I think was the case with Carmel and some of these others, rather than their team being disappointing. If that
like Ignatius as well. Right?
Ignatius,
I put
Providence.
That in this, yeah.
I see.
I see. Yeah.
Yep.
But when I look at Carmel's schedule, I'm trying to determine which games are going to flip that they lost last year. Because the schedule, as you just mentioned, is really tough, right? So, they beat Providence by 3 points, right? So that's going to be another tough game this year. But that was one of their wins. But they had a loss against Montini, loss against DePaul, loss against Loyola, and loss against Fenwick, all going to be really good teams. So they've got another tough road to get to the magic number of wins that are going to get them in the playoffs. But we'll see. But I think those games I just mentioned, they've got to flip one or two of those and, maintain the wins that they had in the conference as well in order for them to kind of take that next step. That's going to be tough for them.
Yeah, if I big picture it, Joe, and because I'm not a coach anymore, I can do this. We can do that, But I'd be really circling that game. Well, they've got a stretch there of Providence, St. Lawrence, Marion, and Montini, where I think they would like to go 4-0, and that would flip two of those games from last year. Obviously, every team would like to go 4-0, but you know what I mean. I think they feel like we're in a really good position. You could extend that even to DePaul and heck, even Loyola. I mean, they've got the personnel to do so. You got to think they've got to feel really good about the return quarterback and everything that he can do and what he can do on his own from a win standpoint.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that I feel like, I don't want to get too deep into this at this point, but I felt like maybe it was too much of Trey Taylor trying to do everything on his own last year. So what I'm hoping for Carmel's sake is that they've got some players they're going to put around Trey Taylor this coming year, and I think that'll make a big difference if they do have some playmakers around him.
Yeah, wouldn't surprise me at all for them to have playmakers somewhere. I know that they have been a program on the rise for several years, and I think with the junior and senior year coming at Trey Taylor, that they're probably pointing to this as a culmination of the building of a program.
Right. All right. So that's a white division, Dan. Let's go to the orange division, and we'll start with Marist. How's that?
Sounds good.
All right. So Marist, really good season. Great season last year. They finished up 9-2. Their only loss last year during the regular season was to Joliet Catholic. So, looking at their schedule this year, I'm looking at 2 games, and there are 2 games right in a row for Marist, and one is against Montini. Then the next week, who they beat last year. Then the next week is against Joliet Catholic, who they lost to in overtime, maybe double overtime last year. I can't remember, but I think those 2 games right in kind of the middle of their schedule or towards the beginning of their schedule, I think are going to be key for them to continue kind of with the success that they started last year.
Yeah, and I think that they are prime in a prime position to make a deep run this year. They've got several key players back. It looks like the non-conference, they're going to step out too or step up, I should say, maybe, and play St. Rita, and so that is a tough matchup. That'll be new this year. Not one that we saw. Southside, really great rivalry game, and that's week 1. So another great game for us to cover early on, and to point to and be a great barometer for both those teams in 2025.
Yeah. So again, I give props to some of these teams that are stepping up in week one and really playing quality opponents here. Now, last year, Marist did play Morgan Park, the first game of the year, who had a really good season, right? But, playing St. Rita game one, you've got to be on right away. Game one, get ready to go.
Pack stands, no room, little margin for error, and I think that's probably – that's a credit to those two teams for saying, yeah, like what you said, bring it on.
Yeah. All right. So next team in the Orange Division is Joliet Catholic, Dan, and we know what they did last year. They had a really, really good season. The problem with Joliet Catholic is they keep having to play Naz, right, or Nazareth.
Right.
So they lost them during the regular season in a great game. I think it was 16-13. And then they lost them again. Let's see, in the playoffs, in the finals, right?
Yeah.
In the state championship game. So, obviously, if you're Joliet Catholic, now they've graduated, some really good players. So I'll be interested.
Quarterback is back.
Is back. One of their wide receivers
is back, and I'm sure they're going to be huge. They did lose a lot of linemen.
Yeah.
But that's never been an issue there, finding big people.
No, it hasn't. And this year, I don't think they're playing Oswego. They lost that game in one of their preseason games. I think they're playing, they're playing Glenbard West.
Yeah, that's a great week 2 game. Glenbard West, Joliet Catholic. The game's going to be over in an hour. Both those teams are ground and pound and really rely on the running game. Be interesting to see. Every year, I think, I wonder if this is the year Joliet Catholic opens it up a little bit. Excuse me. And, they've got the quarterback to do so. Great athlete, stud baseball player. So it'll be interesting to see and watch that game week 2. I like Glenbard West. They are one of those teams that will play anyone anywhere. So this is a great matchup, similar to Oswego and JCA last year.
Yes. So do you think you maybe alluded to this a little bit, but do you think a wrinkle in the Joliet Catholic offense might benefit them, getting them over the hump, maybe getting them over Naz, getting them over, their losses last year were to Naz and Mount Carmel. No shame there, right?
Yeah, and Oswego, right?
And Oswego, yeah. So I don't know. Do you think they need another wrinkle? Or?
I don't. I do think that, well, maybe this is saying yes, but I don't think that they do to be in the playoffs, to make a good playoff run. Now, they'll probably bump up this year as far as the class, but I certainly see them as a playoff team. It'd be nice if they had the ability, if necessary, to have a big drive or as a surprise to be, more than competent passing the football, and to do it confidently. They've got the personnel. It's just that, when you've got all these weapons that can just smash you into the ground, why do anything different? So it'll be that week 2 game against Glenbard West might show us a little bit about if they choose to do anything different, offensively on a more regular basis. But I think having the ability, which I think they have changed over the years to add a little bit of that. You'll see them in trips and you'll see them, various formations. But their personnel might dictate that, in the fact that they may not have. They're going to be playing a lot of new people at skill at the running back position.
Right. Okay. All right. So the next team in the Orange Division is Notre Dame. Dan, last year, tough year for Notre Dame. We talked about them a lot because we followed them, obviously, and we followed their games on Friday Night Blitz. They just had trouble scoring some points last year, and when you look at what they did last year, obviously their schedule is tough, right? Like everybody's. I'm not going to say anybody's isn't tough, but I'm wondering, looking at the schedule this year for Notre Dame, what which one of their losses or a couple of their losses are they going to be able to flip to wins this year, which maybe they can squeak into the playoffs. They lost to St. Lawrence, Providence, St. Rita, Joliet Catholic, Brother Rice, Marist, and St. Ignatius, right?
Yeah.
So
looking at their victories, they were 2-0, so beat
right.
Sterling. So I wonder if that contract is ongoing or if it had to be renewed or where that's at. And they played St. Pat's, and we know that they're not. There's no St. Pat's on the schedule for this year in the non-conference. And so St. Pat's schedule is set. So it'll be interesting to see when Notre Dame comes out with their schedule, what they'll be doing for weeks 1 and 2. So I don't know if they're in that scramble mode or if they've got it and just haven't released it. So that's going to tell us a lot, Joe. The non-conference is going to be important in Notre Dame prior to that schedule, because if it, mimicking last year, it's a tough one. That is not an easy road. Weeks 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 for ND.
Yeah, and for the new coach, Dan DeFranza, right, who we interviewed, he's got his work cut out for him. Now, I know he feels confident, and he said that he's got some good players. He's got some good guys coming back. I think this, like you mentioned earlier with another team with Providence, I think Notre Dame was kind of pointing towards this class to kind of get them back on track here. But still, you just mentioned games, 3 through 8, 9, 3 through 8 are, really tough games against some really good opponents. So, hopefully they can flip a game or two from a loss to a win during that schedule and maybe sneak into the playoffs. Who knows?
Yeah, and my prediction is they're going to be really tough defensively, like they've always been, and the question mark will be on offense, which it has been in the past as well. So new offensive coordinator, formerly at Montini. So it will be interesting to see how that shows out in the early non-conference games.
Right. Yes, it will. Okay, so the last team in the Orange Division is Providence, Dan, and another team tough to figure out last year. Obviously they didn't have the year they wanted to have. Very similar to me to Carmel when we talked about them and the year they had last year. But Providence had some close games, some close losses last year. But again, I look at their schedule and let's see, they were 4-6 last year.
Boy, flip either of those games, week 1 and week 3, both last second losses.
Yes.
And they're in.
Yes. And to be honest, I'm not sure who they're playing in week 1 and 2 this year.
I've got it. It's not easy.
You?
Yeah.
No?
So they open with Wheaton Academy.
Okay.
Really, really good program.
Yeah, state champ from last year, right?
Yeah, Wheaton Academy. And then their week 2 is Lincoln Way Central. And so were they quarterfinalists last year, maybe?
Yeah, although Pravi beat them last year in the second game of the year. So they were so up and down, weren't they, Providence?
It did feel like that.
You'd watch them one game and you'd think, boy, they're going to run the table now. And then all of a sudden something would happen and you'd be like, what just happened with this team?
Yeah, and Coach Platts has a program that's on the rise. I think they're pointing to this. We're familiar with this current junior class, Joe. And
yes, we are.
Yes, so
unfortunately we are. Yes.
Right, and so that's a loaded class, and I think the classes behind them, that are also really, really talented with a great mix of size and speed. So I looked for Providence to leave no doubt this year as if they're if they're a playoff team. I'll be surprised if they're not, because I think while they'll be young, we'll be talking about a lot of juniors and probably some sophomores, but they're incredibly talented.
Yeah, well, they're going to have to flip some losses, obviously. They lost to Marist, they lost to Loyola, they lost to Joliet Catholic, and then they lost to Notre Dame as well at the end of the year. So, they're going to have to flip 1 or 2 of those, if not more, in order to kind of get to the next step for them, which would be, let's get back in the playoffs, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
For sure.
All right, so let's go to the Blue Division, Dan, and Let's start with Mount Carmel. So obviously Mount Carmel state champs. I feel like when I look through all the different schedules and who they're playing and who they've scheduled as far as maybe some of their early games, I feel like Mount Carmel is maybe the one team in the Chicago Catholic League that's pushing to try and get more of that national focus. Do you get that same sense, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, if when you schedule Cincinnati Moeller, two storied programs, there's definitely something there. And last year, opening with the Hun, and so they definitely aren't shy about it. And I think it's one of those things where, if they don't have a contract with someone, they will go big and say, let's go do something that brings us some publicity to the program, exposes us beyond the Catholic League. Obviously, everyone knows their name, that follows high school football, but this kind of puts them out there and puts them in a position to really make a statement on a regional or national level week one.
Right. Yeah, and I think if any team is going to do it, it's going to be Mount Carmel. They've got the they've got the determination, I guess, or the guts to go out there and schedule some of these national level and recognized opponents, which I really like. They had a couple of tough losses last year. One against Brother Rice, 16-13, but I think that's a game that Jack Elliott did not play. And then they lost to Loyola the last game of the year before they went into the playoffs and on their playoff run. If you look at their schedule, you think, okay, what do they want to do? Obviously they probably don't want to lose to Brother Rice again, and they'll probably look at that last conference game of the year against Loyola again this year, and we'll see how this goes.
Yeah.
Against Loyola. I mean, that's the best you can do at that point. But I don't think they have to do all that much different than they did last year.
Yeah, and they've you said they've got the ambition and to do that, but they've also got the talent to back it up. I think they're really talented. We've seen a lot of their players on social media, with a lot of offers. I mean, they are big time. And when I say big time, they're big time, beyond the Catholic League, big time from a personnel perspective this year. So be interesting to watch. Like I said, the early game against Moeller, week 2 against Rita. So that'll be a lot of fun watching them and how it comes together and what they do at quarterback early on.
Yeah, I agree. All right, so let's go to St. Ignatius, Dan, and I guess this will be another one of those teams, right? I've already mentioned 2 of them. I said Carmel, Providence, and now Ignatius, who last year I thought were going to have better years. Although, if you look at what Ignatius did, even though during the their conference schedule they didn't get enough wins to get into the playoffs, they do end up going on and just rolling right through the
Prep Bowl.
The Prep Bowl, yeah, at the end of the year. So, we saw with, who was it? Was that Marist or the year before who did that, or Rita?
Rita, I think, the year before.
Yeah, and then we saw what that did for them coming into the next season. So I'm thinking maybe the same thing for Ignatius, but they do lose some key players from a really good team. But this is another team that's got to flip some really tough losses last year, and I'm not exactly sure how they're going to do it. I mean, they lost to Fenwick in week 2, they lost to Mount Carmel in week 4. They lost to Loyola, they lost to Marist, they lost to Montini, they lost to Brother Rice. The only reason I rattle them all off like that is because those are all really good teams. So, Ignatius's schedule is really, really tough.
Yeah, they got Catholic Leagued last year for sure. And be interesting. I haven't seen anything published about their non-conference schedule, but some games early on to look at with IC and Mount Carmel weeks 3 and 4 should be interesting and telling, and we should learn a lot about their team and some of the new pieces that they'll have in place between those games and their non-conference schedule.
Yeah, I think their first game last year they played St. Louis University. They're playing them again this year, Dan.
Okay. All right.
And then here we go again with DePaul Prep.
Yeah.
Scheduling Ignatius the second week of the year. So,
yeah,
some tough opponents, right? And really good games. Especially, I'm really looking forward to that DePaul Prep Ignatius game.
Yeah, and we'll get more into that with when we talk about DePaul. But yeah, that'll be a fun one. You're right. That one has been announced by DePaul, I think. So that'll be then considering that we have their at least their non-conference or their schedule set with St. Louis University. So we'll know right away, and we'll have some barometer games for on St. Ignatius to see what the outlook is for the rest of the season.
Right. Okay. All right, let's move on to Loyola in the Blue Division. And when I looked at their schedule for this year, I think really all Loyola needs to do is not have any letdowns. And I'm not sure if they're going to play East St. Louis again. I don't see them on their schedule this year, but they don't have the first 2 weeks of the year yet. On the schedule that I could find. But, I really feel like last year playing East St. Louis, the first week of the year, everybody was looking forward to that game. And then it just went, off the rails for Loyola, and they really got beat bad. I feel like that affected them for, the first kind of third of the season. They lost East St. Louis. They then lost to St. Francis a couple weeks later, but then they ended up winning out after that. I just feel like if I were their head coach, and I'm not, but if I were, I would probably try and schedule an opponent that, maybe you can start to build some momentum, because they've got to reload this year after losing some really good players.
Yeah, household names in Fitz and
McPherson.
Yeah, Drew McPherson, household names. So they will have a lot of new faces that will have a chance to get to know this year.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to that. So, another big game. The last conference game of the year, which is against Mount Carmel, obviously everybody be looking forward to that one. If I were Loyola, the one game I'd be really kicking myself over might be the St. Francis game, although St. Francis came and played and they beat them outright.
Took it to them. Took it to
them. So, but you can't argue with what they did the rest of the year, right? So,
Yeah, and they'll have their hands full with St. Francis again. At St. Francis this year, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So Brother Rice, the last team in the Blue Division. Again, when I was looking at this, Dan, I was thinking, if I'm Brother Rice, which losses would I think that I might have a chance to flip from last year to this year? Now, they lost to Rita. They lost to Loyola. They lost to Fenwick. They lost to Marist. There's not one of those teams that I can say for sure that Brother Rice is going to be able to, pick off another game here or there. But, they've got some good talent coming back, especially, they've got the quarterback coming back. Who is this? CJ Gray?
Yeah.
Who is, we know, had a really good year last year, very talented. So, to me, Brother Rice is like, they've got this big question mark behind them, as far as how they're going to do this year, or how I think they're going to do this year, especially when I look at their schedule and how difficult it is.
Yeah, and we'll have to see. They had some coaching changes too. They might have a new offensive coordinator as well. So we'll see early on how that looks, if it's going to look much different, and what the focus will be. So that'll be interesting to check out. And I think they have Valparaiso from Indiana on the schedule. So I think, that'll be an interesting game week 1.
Right.
And, still open week 2, so that we'll see how that, unless you have something different, Joe, but
no, I don't. That's
they have a great program. They always have great numbers and a lot of talent at a lot of different positions, play really strong defense. So they're one that, Joe, they were, we started calling it scramble mode or something last year that was, they were 1-3. I think they were
backs against the wall.
Backs against the wall. Yes. So So it's probably really important for them not to be in that position again.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So the next division, Dan, is Green Division, and let's start with St. Rita. As we know, they had a great season. I was looking at their schedule this year, thinking, what can they do different, from what they did last year? And I'm not sure there's much. I mean, they had 2 losses during the regular season. That was to Mount Carmel and to Nazareth. Sure, they would like to pick off one of those games this year, but again, really difficult schedule. They ended up losing to Mount Carmel again in the playoffs. So they saw them twice, lost them twice. I'm sure that's left kind of a bad taste in their mouth, but maybe picking off one of those games against either Mount Carmel or Naz, and then holding their own and getting the same kind of number of wins that they got last year during their schedule. And that'll put them right back to where they want to be again.
Yeah, they were a really good team last year. Really good. Played great defense. Just came up against a really tough Mount Carmel team twice. And it's, they don't have to wait long for revenge. That's week 2 at Mount Carmel. So there'll be a lot on that game. That'll be one that captures a lot of attention in the Chicago area and throughout the state. So be interesting to see how they shape up, and they're not shy about scheduling people, as we can see. And so they start with I think Marist and Mount Carmel. So
yeah.
So they have their hands full right away, Joe, before they even get into the division.
Yeah, last year they started with Sandberg. This year they replaced Sandberg with Marist. How about that? Yeah.
Tough trade.
Tough schedule for them.
Yeah,
for sure.
Good for them. Good for them.
All right. So the next team here is Nazareth Academy in the Green Division. Again, another state champ here. During the regular season, they had only 2 losses. They lost to Mount Carmel. They lost to St. Francis. St. Francis was a giant killer last year, but then Naz turned around and beat St. Francis in the playoffs, to get them to the finals. So, there's no easy game here for Naz this year, as it's been, for the last several years. So, my thinking on this is, you're probably pointing to that Mount Carmel game again for Naz. See if they can kind of take that next step and maybe knock them off. Obviously, they probably want to avenge the loss they had against St. Francis during the regular season, even though they did that in the playoffs. But, you can't argue with what Naz did last year. And, for them, what they want to do is do the same thing this coming year.
Maintain. And Joe, it's not an easy start for them either. Kankakee gave them a great game last year. And, so they open with them again, and then they've traded Kenwood for Morgan Park. So those are 2 really, really tough games to be breaking in a lot of new people. And so that I see them, having their hands full in weeks 1 and 2, and we'll learn a lot about, they, again, another program that's in reload mode rather than rebuild. We know they've got studs at receiver and still have great players all over, up and down the roster on every level, but they'll be tested early.
Yes, they will. Okay, so I see another one of those teams that probably expected a lot more last year than they got or ended up with. They ended up 4-5, but they did have a forfeit in there as well. I thought we saw them up close and personal, at least some of their underclassmen, and thought, this is a team that's going to be reckoned with, and maybe this is the year that they're pointing to. We'll see, but they had some tough losses last year to Ignatius, to Naz, to Marist, to St. Francis, and then to St. Rita. All those programs or schools are going to be good again this year. So, IC definitely is going to have to take a step up, a next step in order to get a couple more wins and hopefully get themselves into the playoffs.
Yeah, weren't we so confused by them last year? I see, like they, in successive weeks, they get kind of blown out by Naz 33-0, and then kind of go down. I can't remember if the game was down to the wire, but it was tight against Marist.
Yeah, it was
And it
one
looked like
game. Yeah,
it looked like two different teams for IC on several weeks, and 1 week they'd come out and look like world beaters. And as a coach used to tell me, the next week you can look like egg beaters.
Yeah.
So
which coach was that?
probably more than one, but they've got the talent there. Like you said, we saw it up close and personal, and think that they should be in line for some good things the next couple of years.
Yeah, and they start off with, I think, the same team they played last year, which is St. Mary's from St. Louis.
Yeah, tough game, right? They won that game in overtime, and St. Mary's is a good program. I imagine, so this year I'm guessing it's at IC. So that'll be interesting to see how St. Mary's does with the travel and everything that goes along with that. So that'll be a fun one to watch.
Yeah. All right, so let's go to the last team in the Green Division. That's St. Francis. They finished 10-3 last year. Ended up losing in the playoffs to Nazareth. They had a couple losses during I'll call it the regular season. They lost to St. Rita. They lost to Providence. And then they had those key wins that we talked about, where they beat Mount Carmel and they beat Nazareth. Things that a lot of teams were not able to do last year. It'll be interesting to see, what St. Francis does this year, because I feel like they surprised some people in some games last year, whereas, some of their losses, maybe one, maybe two of them, you wouldn't have thought that they were going to get the loss. But, the other big thing for them is they lost their quarterback, right?
Yeah.
Who transferred. So, I'm sure they've got somebody who was waiting in the wings, of course. But again, another team with a really tough schedule who had some close games last year and losses or wins, that when you look at the schedule, you think, a lot of these games could go either way.
And Joe, I like week 2 for St. Francis at Mount Zion. So Mount Zion, state finalists last year. DePaul kind of took it to them a little bit, but they were one that had they've got I think they've got a Division I kid returning, big tight end that they split out last year, if I remember right. I can't remember if he was a senior or junior, but kind of a program on the rise. And I think good for Mount Zion for doing this, because they didn't like how that felt. And I think they felt surprised by playing a Catholic League team in the state championship. So good for Mount Zion and St. Francis for putting them on the schedule, and that's going to tell us a lot. Kenwood was a tighter game, I think, than maybe a lot of folks thought. So that'll be a good one early on. But I'm really looking forward to that week 2.
Yeah, me too. I think it'll be good. Yeah, and I think I said Mount Carmel. I meant to say Loyola, who St. Francis knocked off last year. Yeah. So they can.
By the way, too, Joe, they've got a ton of talent. We talked about the quarterback, Palmer leaving, but they are loaded.
Loaded, yes. And I can't wait to watch the wide receiver play. Zach Washington.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to watching him this year. He picked up obviously had a great year last year, and he picked up a ton of offers, over the course of the last several months. So, sky's the limit for him, and I'm sure they've got somebody waiting in the wings that can get him the ball.
Yeah, all dog team, Zach Washington.
All dog team, yep, for sure. All right, so let's go to the Red Division, Dan, and let's start with Marmion. And would you say that Marmion put themselves kind of back on the map last year? I mean, I feel like they made progress in Coach Guerra's first year. They went 5-5, get to the playoffs, so they lose the first game in the playoffs, but I would think that Coach Guerra is looking for them now to take kind of that next step this coming year.
Yeah, and I hope we can have Coach Guerra on again, because he was a great interview. And after that conversation, I remember thinking they're going to be pretty good. He liked specifically. He really liked how big and strong they were. Right. And when you can say that, it's like that's a good thing to say and have in your back pocket. So if they've got the same type of work ethic and the same type of kids, and I don't know how their lower levels did, but I think he's a program builder. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens in year 2.
It will be. And if you look at who they lost to last year, they lost during the regular season. They lost to Vider, they lost to Montini, they lost to IC, they lost to Marist. If you're going to flip some of those games, I would think maybe the Vider game is one you flip this coming year. Who knows?
Yeah, who knows?
We don't know how good Vider is going to be this coming year, but if you really want to take that next step as a program, you've got to start beating some of the teams like this that maybe you lost to the year before. So,
well, and you don't want anyone to flip it on you.
Exactly.
Right. So you have to look at the wins too and be like, oh, can they flip that? So
hopefully not. Yeah.
I mean, so late in the year, I mean, Leo, pretty close game, so that, and I don't know how that played out, but Marion. So I'm sure they want to control the division. That's probably their first goal. They know if they do that, they've got a good shot at getting in again.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go to another team in the Red Division, and that's De La Salle. Last year, really strange year for De La Salle. Obviously they started off the season. They didn't, necessarily start off all that well, but eventually they just ran out of players or healthy players, so they had to forfeit, kind of the last couple games of the year. Prior to that, they had one win, and that was against Foreman. So, I think De La Salle, if you talk about regrouping, rebuilding, reloading, that's what De La Salle is going to try and do this year, Dan.
Yeah, tough, and it'll be a good start. And they play Revis, week 1, and so that's going to give us a great insight as to where their program stands. It'll be good to see numbers. It'll be good to see if they can. They got to the point where they were having a tough time, Joe, doing the basics and even getting the snap back, to run a play, So I could understand it sucks for those seniors who didn't get a chance to finish their season, but we'll see with a year under Coach Blackman's belt. I think they're going to look like a different team this year. I don't know what that will translate to as results, but should be a better looking team as far as getting some of the basics down this year.
Yeah, Coach Blackman said, when he had to come out and talk about why they weren't able to play the rest of their games. I think he mentioned in that article or the interview I saw that, they're at the younger levels, their numbers were good. They were looking forward to kind of moving forward after this year. So hopefully that proves itself out this year for De La Salle. Whether or not they're going to get more wins, who knows, but to see them be able to field a team and a team that's competitive, I think for them at this point and where they're at and kind of this rebuild or redevelopment of the program, that's a win for them.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So Marion Catholic, next team in the Red Division. We interviewed Coach Lopez last year before the season started. I couldn't necessarily get a great handle on how they were going to be at that point. Now, obviously they ended up 2-8. So, they didn't have a very good year. They lost home with Flossmoor in the second game of the year. They lost to DePaul Prep. They did beat Leo. They beat Rich Township the first game of the year. But, for them, the schedule's the same. Dan, it doesn't get any easier. I'm not sure, where they're going to, make some gains from last year to this year. Maybe, if you're looking at, the Marmion game, maybe they, get a better game there and can get a win. But we know what the Marmion program is doing. They're kind of on the rise. So, Marion is just getting CCL'd for sure. And I'm not sure where they're going to kind of step up and get some additional wins this coming year.
Well, we can look at week 1, Joe. It looks like they're going to play St. Viator. So that's a fun week 1 and
it is
one that I'll pay attention to. Love to get Coach Gold on and have an interview and find out where their program's at. They've lost a ton of people. So, but anyway, talking about Marion, yeah. So we'll have a pretty good idea. I felt like they were a team that was one of those that was maybe the scores didn't indicate it, but they were improving, as the year went on. So depending on how many folks they get back and where those what positions those people are in, will determine a lot and see how they are. But week 1 gives us a great shot to make some, kind of revise maybe or look at predictions for what we have going on, because it's another Catholic League team.
Yes, and I'm sure our prognosticus will be very active for week 1.
Yeah,
trying to make some predictions. It's going to be tough week 1 making some predictions, I think, for some of these games, because we really don't know where some of these teams are at based on, we know how good some of them have been and some of them who've been challenged, over the past couple years. But, you never know from year to year as far as some of the talent that's coming up from the younger levels.
Yeah, especially with new coaches too, and what they've been able to do, how they've been able to make changes to the program, and so it is. It's a part of the beauty of high school football, Joe. We don't have any 6-year contracts, so a lot of change every year. You can go off reputation. Reputation only takes you so far. So be interesting to see how things look against another CCL team week 1.
Yeah, so the last team in the red division is Leo, and we know they had a really tough year last year. They only won 1 game, and I believe that was against the Noble Academy. So they were 1-8. They've got a new coach this year. What's his name? I think you mentioned who he was before, Dan. Do you remember?
On the spot. I don't have it in front of me.
All right, that's fine. But it's really going to be tough for them I think they've got some decent returning talent. Maybe they've been able to get some additional talent in the building, but we don't know that. We'll probably try and get their coach on.
Yeah, we've got some work to do with some of these new coaches.
Yeah, but their schedule is not easy, right? As far as Chicago Catholic League. I mean, they've got St. Pat's, they've got Marian Catholic, they've got St. Lawrence, they've got Rita, they've got Notre Dame, they've got Marmion. So, if you're looking at, is it the toughest schedule in the Chicago Catholic League? No, but each of those teams, are always going to be good. And for a team like Leo, who's really trying to get back on track here and trying to kind of build their program, it'll be interesting to see where they're at this year, and we'll probably be able to tell after their first couple games of the year.
Yeah, I mean, they open with Amundsen. No, that's week 2 is Amundsen of the public league. And so if I'm them, behind closed doors with the coaches, I'm looking at Amundsen and my division. I really want to make some hay and then be the team that has the ability to scare some people in the Catholic League in some of the crossover games. The red division, has a tough. They only play up. Right. It's one of the downsides of this is that your crossovers are only bigger, more established schools. So for them, I'm looking at week 1 and then De La Salle and Marmion and Marian Catholic as where I want to really, really measure some change in the program.
Right. Yeah. And hopefully, I would be, if I were the coach or if I were the school administrators, athletic director, I would be encouraged by, even some small steps, from the program, right?
Yep.
Whether it's an additional win, whether it's, the program numbers are up from last year to this year, those kinds of things, if you look a little bit deeper into the details, you can point to those and say, you know what, we are on the right track here. So for me, what I would love to see for Leo is looking into some of those details and seeing that maybe they're turning things around, they're on the right track, and they're making some progress.
Good point. Good point.
Okay. All right. Let's go to the last division we'll cover, and that's a purple division. Let's start with our favorite team, the Red Wings, Bennett Academy, Dan. Yeah. Yes. Now, I did want to ask you a question about Bennett. Did they surprise you at all last year, or did they do what you expected of them?
I feel like they did. Maybe a little, the surprise, Joe, is they were able to win the purple, and it wasn't always pretty, but going on and seeing what DePaul did, and knowing that Bennett beat them and in week 9, so it wasn't like it was a week 1 game,
right?
So I guess in hindsight maybe you can call that a surprise, but I always think they're going to be competitive and they're going to play hard. I think, and on the other side, I think that some of the losses surprised me as well. The loss to Naz was ugly, and some of those things, I don't think that coach knew would want to lack competitiveness in some of the losses that they've had. So I think that they're in a pretty good spot, and they've got to replace a quarterback that was a big part of their offense, but they've got some players back, and they don't play Moline early on. That's the first time in several years that Moline's not on the schedule, but they replace him with Glenbard North. Big public school, a lot of numbers there. So that's going to be a great barometer for Bennett early on, and Hillcrest. Both those schools are great challenges for Bennett. Will be really good tests to see how the new players in key positions are doing, how they have the ability to get Luke Doyle the football, and who else is going to step up like some of those guys did last year. So I don't know that I was surprised. I think they were a team that competed hard against teams they should, but I'd like to see them compete against some of the more traditional powers too.
Yeah, I think I feel the exact same way, Dan.
Yeah.
I was a little bit surprised at their record and how let's say how well they did. Overall they were 7-4. What I would like to see out of Bennett this year, which would tell me that they're taking kind of that next step, is some of the losses they took last year against Mount Carmel, against Fenwick, against Naz, who are all really good teams. I mean, we're blowouts, right? I would like to see, like you said, some of those games be a little bit closer, where Bennett is maybe in the game, maybe has a chance to win one of those games at the end of the game, something like that. I think if that were the case, I would say that, hey, Bennett is, taking that next step, and maybe at some point here they're going to be able to run with the big boys here in the Chicago Catholic League.
Yeah, and it's we have to look too. A lot of these teams, Joe, we talked about last year as they had several years in a row of 4-5. So Bennett was one of those teams,
right?
And so they did take a step. That's for sure. But to keep where they're at and with being more competitive in some of these games, would be seen as a step.
Yes. Okay, let's move to the next team in the purple, which I think is going to be one of the more interesting teams to watch this year, and that's St. Viator with their new head coach, Robbie Gold. We know last year Viator did not maybe perform up to what their expectations might have been. They lost to Bennett, they lost to Ignatius, they lost to Paul Prep, they lost to Montini, they lost to IC. I think they were probably thinking, that they were going to pick off one or two of those games, and their season might have been a lot different if they had been able to do that. I do feel like this is one team that's lost a ton of talent. I have no idea as far as where Viator is going to be this coming year from a talent standpoint, and who we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, that'll be really fun. And like I said, we have to work to get Coach Gold on, because I'd like to hear about some of the players they have, and we're familiar with them too. So from the coaching days, and so there's a lot of unknown there. The only known is Coach Gold, and so they were last year the tale of two teams, right? Start out 3-0 offense, clicking on all cylinders, and drop their next, I don't know,
five, and
drop their next 5 to kind of take them out of contention. And I felt like some of those were bad losses, and where they were the more talented team, and for some reason it didn't work out. So you want to get that corrected. You want to have a bit of a grinder mentality there. I could say the same thing about St. Viator that we've said about Bennett. Grind a little bit more, in against some of the step ups that you have, and see how everything shakes out. But yeah, a lot of unknown with St.
Yeah, they've got to hold their own on the games they won last year. Their first 2 games, their third game, they've got to They've got to play Marmion. They've got to win that, and then they've got to flip one game, that they lost last year, and then it gets them into the playoffs. And that's not going to be easy because it's Bennett, Ignatius, DePaul Prep, Montini, IC, right? So, they lost to all those teams last year. They've got to flip at least one of those games. So Coach Gold has got a challenge in front of him, and it'll be fun or interesting to see how they do.
Yeah, he flipped the program around where he was in why can't I think
Rolling Meadows?
Thank you, Rolling Meadows, and got them back to the playoffs in a really short order. So he knows what he's doing. So it'll be super interesting to see how they are early on.
Yeah. Okay. So the next team in the purple is DePaul Prep, DePaul College Prep. We know state champs. Great year last year, 11-3 overall. When I look at their schedule this year, Dan, some of the games that kind of stand out to me really are
everyone.
They've got a tough schedule, and they're last year they started with Deerfield, and then they had Marion Central Catholic. This year they're going Fenwick, first game of the year, and then St. Ignatius the next game after that. So they're not scheduling any weak sisters in games 1 and 2.
No. And Joe, can we claim the Varsity Voices effect on week 2 with DePaul and St. Ignatius? Did we create that? Did we speak it into existence?
I think so. And go ahead and tell the story real quick, Dan.
Last year, one of our interviews early on as young podcasters, we had Coach Passarella on, and one of the things that we like to ask is who do the kids consider their rivals? And he, without hesitation, said St. Ignatius, and it kind of surprised both of us. There weren't geographically, it didn't seem like it might be a fit, or there was no hesitation there. Several weeks later, we had on Coach Miller from St. Ignatius and brought that to his attention, and he wasn't quite sure that it resonated like maybe it did with DePaul Prep, and wasn't sure that it could be scheduled because they were in contracts and they had commitments. And lo and behold, week 2, we see a DePaul Prep and playing St. Ignatius. So that is at St. Ignatius. So, we know that'll be really interesting because we know what Coach Passarella and the players there, they kind of red letter that game, and we'll see if St. Ignatius has a fire. I'm sure they will. Week 2 is early. Everyone's still really fired up. So, but that's an interesting one, and maybe we call that the Varsity Voices Classic.
All right. Yeah, that sounds good to me. Let's do that. And okay. I'm sure
we'll just do it. Yeah. So it'll get adopted into lore several years from now. Yeah.
Yeah. Coach Passarella will be all on board with that too, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And if you're thinking about DePaul Prep and Coach Passarella and what he would, like to see this year, I mean, how do you build on a state championship, right? But I would think that they want to continue to play or stay at that level, and always be in kind of that mix. But they're going to jump a couple classes this year, obviously, but from a playoff standpoint. But they had a couple of tough losses against, teams that I would think Coach Passarella is probably like, that's a level we want to be at every year in and year out and be able to compete at. They lost big to Loyola during the season. They lost in a tough game to St. Francis. They also lost to Bennett, like you mentioned, the last game of the year. I'm sure he would love to flip that game.
Right.
So I feel like those are the kind of things they're going to be looking at for this year and their conference schedule.
Yeah. Well, we called them a team on the rise last year. I think they're still in that mode. Now it'll be tested with some of the the schedule that they have, and then should they get in the playoffs again, it'll be tested there too. So we'll see what that does for the program. But there's no doubt that with their situation, number of players, offers that players have, high profile players, that they're definitely still on the rise. So I don't know where the top is that with them, but I think the goal is to be mentioned in the same breath with Loyola and Mount Carmel and some of these South Side schools as well.
Right. And we know they lost some really good players from last year's team, but you and I are close enough to this. We also know that they've got some really talented underclassmen who are coming up this year who might be able to step right in and continue at that same level of play that they were able to do last year.
Yeah, I think that's the hope. Same level or more.
Yes. All right. So the last team in the Purple Division, the last team I think we're talking about here is St. Pat's, and another team within the Chicago Catholic League that didn't have the record or the season that they were hoping for last year. I think they finished 2-7. They had a couple of wins. I think they beat Larkin last year, and they beat Leo, and they had kind of two close losses, Dan. One to Notre Dame. They lost 15-13. They also lost to St. Lawrence and actually put up a really good game against St. Lawrence, lost 24-13. But if you're St. Pat's, you've got to be looking at some of those losses and thinking, we can do better. We can take some steps. But if you look at the rest of them, it's another team that I'm looking at and thinking they've got to look a little bit deeper and see where can we make some progress and what are we going to look at, especially during the season, at the end of the season, and say, yes, we are making progress here as a football program.
Well, Joe, a little early glimpse into how I feel about some of these divisions. I think St. Pat's is going to surprise.
Wow!
I think I if you remember right, they're huge, and they started to figure something out. If you look at what is it? Maybe the Bennett game, and they put up 30 points. If you remember, covered that game. They were kind of rolling in the running game. Yes. And Coach Zibikowski is a guy that's going to preach toughness and physical football. I think they're going to build. I think they've got a ton of returners, and I think a lot of those returners are up front, and they're gigantic.
Yes, and I do remember that.
Yeah. Yes, so I think the expectations are going to be higher than what you're putting on them there. And I think they're in a position to make some noise and give a lot of people fits. And yeah, it's a glimpse into my view of the purple, but I would look out for St. Pat's a little bit.
I would love to see that, Dan. I really would, because they've got a tough schedule. They played DePaul College Prep, they played Brother Rice, they play Bennett, they play Lawrence, they play Rita, and that's a tough stretch. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 games in a row playing playoff teams from last year and a state champ as well. If they can make that kind of progress, or what you're talking about, and surprise, one or two of those teams during that stretch, I think that's great for the Chicago Catholic League to have St. Pat's back.
Yeah, and I love their non-conference schedule. They have Yorkville and Larkin. I think those are two great measuring sticks and the types of programs that is exactly what you're looking for, kind of competitive. I know they maybe took it to Larkin last year. They did, and they might do that again. But I think both of those schools should be really good litmus tests for St. Pat's to see where they're at, and it's going to give us an idea of what they've done to build upon what they started to do, after in week 6 last year.
All right, good. So that covers the whole Chicago Catholic League, Dan.
Already?
And all the schedules. Can you believe we got through that in less than an hour and 30 minutes?
4 hours, yeah.
But I think it was very interesting and enthralling conversation.
Enthralling, right? Yes.
Good word,
on
right?
The edge of their seats. Yep.
Yes, I'm sure everybody's on the edge of seats, and they've stayed for the whole podcast, which we appreciate. As always, thank you for listening, and make sure you like, you follow, you subscribe to us wherever you're listening from. And Find us on social media. We're out there on all the different social media sites. And also make sure if you've got a comment, you've got a question, you can find us. You can put that in anywhere you're listening from your podcast or on any of our social media sites. So, but as always, we appreciate you listening, and we will look forward to talking with you soon.